You can't even read the warning labels on those bottles. Stick to mopping. The surgeon's laugh echoed in the sterile hall as he turned back to his patient's chart. He didn't see the janitor's hands, steady from decades of battlefield triage, or know the patient coding behind the next door would need those exact hands to live. Her name was Sandra, and to the staff of Mercy General, she was just the quiet woman who cleaned the ER. But this scene, where a life hung in the balance while arrogance blinded the very people meant to save it, wasn't just a dramatic moment. It was rooted in a painful, hidden history of who gets seen as capable in a hospital. A history where people like Vivian Thomas pioneered surgery while listed as a janitor. So what happens when the person you dismissed as invisible is the only one who can see the solution? Sandra Wilson clocked in at Mercy General Hospital every day at 5 p.m. She collected her cart, her gloves, her keys. To the nursing staff, she was the reliable, quiet presence who emptied the bins and mopped the floors without being asked. To the residents, she was part of the background. But Sandra's hands, which now sorted recycling, had once performed emergency thoracotomies in the dust of Kandahar. She was a retired lieutenant colonel and trauma surgeon, with over 2,000 combat procedures under her belt. She took the janitorial job not out of necessity, but by design. It let her be near medicine without the politics, a quiet observer in the place that needed the most watching. The surgeon who mocked her was Dr. Richard Vance, the newly appointed head of cardiothoracic surgery. He was a product of a system that equated pedigree with skill, Ivy League, published, and acutely aware of his own status. On his first day, he'd reviewed the staff directory and pointedly asked administration why so many support roles were, in his words, filled with unskilled labor. He believed in clear hierarchies. The doctors thought, the nurses acted, the janitors cleaned. It was an order he enforced with casual cruelty. Mercy General itself was a pressure cooker, a prestigious, underfunded public hospital serving a diverse urban community. It had a reputation for excellent emergency care, but was riddled with internal strife and a culture of siloed departments. The ER was chronically overwhelmed. Tensions between the veteran nursing staff and the new wave of specialist surgeons like Vance were a constant low hum. Into this ecosystem, Sandra moved silently, her military-trained eyes missing nothing. The missed dosage check, the mislabeled specimen, the growing complacency. For weeks she watched Vance. She saw him belittle a nurse for a question about a post-op order. She heard him dismiss a resident's concern about a patient's dropping blood pressure, calling it anxiety. His arrogance wasn't just personality, it was a systemic filter. He saw only credentials, not competence. He could not conceive that expertise could exist outside the framework he recognized. This blindness was the hospital's open secret. A study from just last year found over a third of physicians witness discrimination in their own departments, yet it persists, often unchallenged. Sandra's past was a ghost in the hospital's hallways. 8 years prior, she'd been a legend at a military medical center. Her specialty was damage control surgery, making impossible split-second decisions to keep soldiers alive long enough to reach definitive care. A roadside bomb blast severed a femoral artery. She'd clamp it with one hand while calling for blood with the other. But after 20 years of service and the loss of her younger brother, also a medic, to friendly fire, she left. The weight of the uniform became too heavy. She sought anonymity, a place where her hands could still be useful without carrying the burden of command. Then came the night of October 12th. The ER was a wall of sound, alarms, shouts, the rush of a gurney. A construction worker, Miguel, had fallen 3 stories onto rebar. A steel bar impaled his chest, missing his heart by millimeters but causing a catastrophic tension pneumothorax, a trapped lung collapsing his other organs. Vance was paged stat. He strode into the trauma bay, his team forming around him. They assessed. The plan was to transfer Miguel to the OR for a controlled procedure. But Sandra, stocking gloves in the adjacent bay, heard the monitor's specific, piercing whine. She knew that sound. It wasn't the sound of a patient who could wait. Vance called for imaging. A nurse pointed out the patient's crashing oxygen saturation. Vance waved her off, focused on the scan results. He was following protocol, the textbook pathway. But in trauma, the textbook is often written by those who have never been on the battlefield. Sandra saw what the monitors screamed and Vance's focus missed. Miguel wasn't just declining, he was seconds from cardiac arrest. The pressure in his chest was about to stop his heart. The required procedure was a needle decompression, simple for any trained trauma professional. But in that room, frozen by hierarchy, no one moved. Vance looked up from the screen, his face etched with frustration at the slowing vitals. "Someone get me a working ultrasound now," he barked. The respiratory therapist bagged the patient faster. The nurse's eyes darted between the monitor and the surgeon. The moment of collective paralysis stretched, and in that silence from the doorway came a calm, clear voice that cut through the chaos. "It's a tension pneumo. You need to relieve the pressure, right now." All heads turned. It was the janitor. Sandra stood there, her blue scrubs a stark contrast to the green surgical gowns, her latex-gloved hand pointing not at the wound, but at the specific intercostal space on Miguel's chest. Vance's face contorted from professional frustration into pure, unvarnished contempt. The system and the patient had reached the cliff's edge. Every eye in the trauma bay locked on Sandra. Vance's face flushed a deep crimson. "Get back to your mop bucket," he snarled, the words dripping with venom. But the cardiac monitor answered with a long, flat whine. Miguel's heart had stopped. The room erupted into controlled panic. "Code blue, time of arrest 0947, a nurse shouted. Vance barked orders for epinephrine and prepared to charge the defibrillator. But Sandra knew what the textbook didn't emphasize in this scenario. With a tension pneumothorax, CPR and shocks are nearly useless until you relieve the pressure crushing the heart. Every second of compression was just moving a heart trapped in a vacuum. She didn't wait for permission. In 3 swift strides, she was at the supply cart, her movements economical and precise. She grabbed a 14-gauge angiocatheter, tore open the sterile packaging with her teeth, a move born of muscle memory in a field hospital. The respiratory therapist, a veteran named Ben, met her eyes. He'd served 2 tours in Iraq. He recognized the certainty in her posture, the way her hands didn't shake. He gave a nearly imperceptible nod and shifted his body, subtly blocking Vance's line of advance. Sandra palpated Miguel's chest, finding the second intercostal space mid-clavicular line in an instant. Without ceremony, she inserted the needle. A loud, unmistakable hiss of escaping air filled the sudden silence. The pressure was released. Then she turned to the crash cart. "Switch to bilateral finger thoracostomies. He needs tubes, not a needle. Scalpel, please." The words were not a request. The circulating nurse, Maria, handed her the instrument without thinking, compelled by the absolute authority in Sandra's voice. Vance stood frozen, a spectator in his own trauma bay, as Sandra performed the emergency procedure with a speed and dexterity that left no doubt. Her hands moved with a practiced grace that spoke of hundreds of repetitions under fire. She made 2 small incisions, inserted chest tubes to reinflate the lungs, and connected them to drainage systems. "Resume compressions," she said calmly. This time, when they shocked Miguel, a rhythm flickered, then stabilized on the monitor. A pulse returned. The silence that followed was louder than the code. Beeps and alarms now sounded like a victory march. Nurses and techs stared, their expressions shifting from shock to awe. Vance found his voice, but it was thin, brittle. "Who the hell do you think you are? You're not credentialed to touch a patient. I'll have you arrested." Sandra didn't look at him. She was watching the monitor, assessing. "His name is Miguel, and he's alive." She peeled off her bloody gloves and dropped them in the biohazard bin. Then she walked out of the trauma bay, past the stunned surgical resident who had recorded the entire event on his phone. The video didn't stay private for long. By the next shift change, it was the only thing anyone was talking about. It spread through the hospital's internal messaging, then leaked to social media. The contrast was stark, the arrogant surgeon frozen in indecision and the calm janitor executing a life-saving battlefield procedure. Comments exploded. "That's a trauma surgeon's hands," one user wrote. "She moved like she's done that 1,000 times," said another. Local news stations picked up the story, framing it as a feel-good mystery. But inside Mercy General, the mood was fractious. Administration called an emergency meeting. The focus wasn't on Miguel's survival, but on liability. The chief medical officer, Dr. Helen Reed, was a bureaucrat more concerned with insurance premiums than miracles. "An uncredentialed janitor performed an invasive surgical procedure," she stated, tapping the table. "We are exposed." Vance, desperate to salvage his reputation, launched a counter-narrative. He claimed Sandra had acted recklessly, that he was moments away from performing the correct procedure in the controlled environment of the OR. He filed a formal complaint against her for practicing medicine without a license, and against Ben and Maria for insubordination. He pressured the hospital's legal team to threaten Sandra with termination and prosecution. But the video evidence was damning, and public sentiment was a tidal wave they couldn't control. A national veterans group caught wind of the story. They enhanced the shaky phone footage, zooming in on Sandra's technique. One retired Army surgeon went on the morning news and said, "That's not just medical training. That's United States Army Ranger medic-level trauma intervention. That woman has seen combat." This triggered the first major pivot. A researcher at the VA hospital, curious, ran facial recognition through a closed database of military medical personnel. It hit a match. Her name wasn't just Sandra Wilson. It was Lieutenant Colonel Sandra Wilson, MD, formerly of the 75th Ranger Regiment's Forward Surgical Team. Her service record was declassified and leaked to a journalist within hours. The document read like a script: commendation for valor during the siege of a remote outpost, where she operated for 48 hours straight under artillery fire. Developer of a field-expedient transfusion protocol that cut mortality rates by 20%. Honorable discharge after 22 years. The journalist dug deeper, finding the obituary for her brother, Corporal David Wilson, a medic killed by mistaken friendly fire in the same province where Sandra had served. Her retirement wasn't just an end of service, it was an escape from grief. The story transformed from a viral clip into a national conversation about hidden expertise and systemic bias. News segments juxtaposed Sandra's story with that of Vivian Thomas, the black cardiac pioneer listed as a janitor. Experts cited the Commonwealth Fund study showing 30% of younger healthcare workers are stressed by racism and discrimination. The hospital was now under a microscope. Reporters camped in the lobby. Miguel's family gave an emotional press conference, calling Sandra an angel. Donations poured in for his recovery, but also for a legal defense fund for Sandra. Inside the hospital, the walls of hierarchy began to crack. Veteran nurses, long resentful of Vance's condescension, started openly questioning his protocols. The head of the ER, Dr. Aris Thorne, reviewed the case and quietly shredded Vance's complaint. He then did something unprecedented. He requested an emergency credentialing review for Sandra through the hospital's bylaws, citing a rarely used eminent skill clause designed for disaster scenarios. This forced the board's hand. They could either embrace the public relations miracle or side with Vance and face a media firestorm. The board scheduled a hearing for Friday at 9 a.m. to determine Sandra's future, and by extension, Vance. But Vance wasn't finished. In a private meeting with Dr. Reed, he played his trump card. He had accessed Sandra's personnel file. She never disclosed her medical degree or her license on her job application, he argued. That's fraud. She's been lying to us from day one, and her state medical license, it's inactive, lapsed. She's not legally a doctor right now. He leaned forward. We don't have a hero, we have an imposter who got lucky, and we have every right to press charges. Dr. Reed saw a way out, a path that protected the hospital from litigation and placated their star surgeon. She authorized the legal department to prepare dismissal papers and alert the state medical board. On Thursday night, the night before the hearing, Sandra sat in her small apartment. A certified letter from the hospital's lawyers lay unopened on her table. Her phone rang. It was Ben, the respiratory therapist. His voice was low, urgent. "Sandra, you need to check the staff portal. Vance just filed a new incident report. He's claiming you caused a pneumothorax in a different patient last week, that you've been practicing secretly. They're fabricating a pattern. They're going to bury you at the hearing tomorrow." He paused, and security just escorted Maria out of the building. "They're cleaning house." Sandra looked at the unopened letter, then at her brother's photo on the mantel. The battle had left the trauma bay and entered a darker, more bureaucratic theater of war. The hearing in the morning wouldn't be about truth. It would be about which story the institution chose to believe, and the weapons would be paperwork, procedure, and lies. The hospital's boardroom at 9 a.m. was a theater of silent power. Sunlight glared off the polished table, illuminating the grim faces of the 7 board members. Dr. Helen Reed presided. Richard Vance sat with his lawyer, a stack of pristine folders before him. Sandra entered alone, wearing simple slacks and a blouse, her posture erect. The room was packed with observers, a few supportive nurses, hospital lawyers, and a court reporter. The air was thick with unspoken accusations. Reed began without ceremony. "This hearing will determine if Sandra Wilson violated hospital policy and state law, and what disciplinary action up to and including termination and referral to law enforcement is warranted." She turned to Vance. "Dr. Vance, present your complaint." Vance stood, smooth and rehearsed. He described the night of the code, framing Sandra's actions as a dangerous, reckless intervention by an emotionally disturbed individual. Then he dropped the first bomb. "But this wasn't an isolated incident. We have evidence of a pattern." He presented a fabricated incident report, dated the previous week, alleging Sandra had improperly treated a patient with a nosebleed, causing complications. A nurse named Chloe, whom Vance had pressured, gave shaky testimony confirming the false event. Then Vance played his ace. Most critically, Ms. Wilson engaged in deliberate fraud. Her job application lists no medical training. Her state medical license lapsed 3 years ago. She is not a doctor. She is a janitor with a savior complex and a history of trauma. He slid copies of her application and her lapsed license status across the table. The board members shifted, their expressions hardening. The narrative was shifting from heroic janitor to unstable imposter. Sandra waited, her hands folded. When invited to speak, she didn't address the fabricated charges first. Instead, she asked a single question. "Dr. Vance, what is the mortality rate for an untreated tension pneumothorax in a trauma setting before reaching the operating room?" Vance blinked. "That's irrelevant to the proceedings." "It's 90%, Sandra stated, her voice clear. "Miguel's chance of survival, following your planned pathway of transport to the OR, was less than 10%. My actions, which you call reckless, gave him an 85% chance. He is alive. That is the only relevant outcome." She then turned to the board. "You have my service record. You know my training. My license is inactive because I chose not to renew it after my brother's death. I left clinical practice to grieve, not because I forgot how to save a life. The fraud you allege is a paperwork discrepancy. The real issue is that this hospital's culture values credentials over competence and protocol over patience." Then came the first countermove. Ben, the respiratory therapist, stood from the observers section. "I have something to say." Reed tried to gavel him down, but he spoke over her. "I was in that trauma bay. Dr. Vance was frozen. The patient was dying. Sandra acted. And as for that incident report from last week," he pulled out his phone. "I have the staff schedule. Nurse Chloe was in the pediatric wing that entire shift. She wasn't even on the adult floor. This is a fabrication." Chloe, from her seat, burst into tears and admitted Vance had threatened her with dismissal if she didn't comply. The boardroom erupted. Vance's lawyer objected vehemently, but the seed of doubt was planted. The hearing devolved into a he said, she said stalemate until the door opened. A woman in a sharp suit entered, followed by a man carrying a briefcase. "My name is Evelyn Shaw," the woman announced. "I represent the State Medical Board's investigative division. We received a complaint regarding fraudulent credentialing at Mercy General. Our investigation, however, has taken a different turn." She nodded to her colleague, who opened the briefcase. "We are here to present evidence of a pattern of systemic misconduct by Dr. Richard Vance, which directly impacts this hearing." This was the "wait, it gets worse" moment. Evelyn Shaw distributed folders. Inside were notarized statements from 3 former colleagues of Vance from his previous hospital. A cardiac surgeon from Boston described how Vance had misrepresented data in a research paper, claiming credit for a technique developed by a resident. A nurse from Philadelphia detailed how Vance had pressured her to alter medication records after a dozing error he had made. The third was a malpractice settlement, sealed by a non-disclosure agreement that had been leaked. It involved a patient who died after Vance dismissed a critical lab value as an artifact. The settlement was for $2.5 million. Mercy General had never been informed. Vance had listed the gap in his employment as a sabbatical. Vance's face went sheet white. His lawyer leaned over, whispering furiously. The board members were now staring at their star surgeon with dawning horror. Dr. Reed tried to regain control. This is outside the scope of this hearing." Evelyn Shaw fixed her with a steely gaze. "Is it? You are judging the competency and ethics of a janitor who saved a life. Meanwhile, you have a surgeon with a documented history of negligence and fraud leading your department. Your hospital's credentialing committee failed its most basic duty. This isn't about one incident. It's about which one of them is the real danger to patients." Room was in chaos. Board members argued. Vance shouted that the documents were forgeries. In the tumult, Sandra remained still, watching the institution tear itself apart. Then the final revelation of the hearing came from an unexpected source. The hospital's head of human resources, a meticulous man named Carl, had been quietly reviewing Vance's personnel file against Sandra. He stood up, holding 2 pieces of paper. "There's another discrepancy," he said, his voice nervous but firm. Dr. Vance's application states he completed a prestigious surgical fellowship at Massachusetts General Hospital in 2012. Our standard verification request was sent, but the response was filed incorrectly. I re-verified this morning." He took a deep breath. "Mass General has no record of a Richard Vance completing that fellowship in that year. They have a record of a Richard Vance enrolling, but he was dismissed for unprofessional conduct after 6 months." The gasp was collective. Vance had built his career on a lie. The boardroom descended into pandemonium. Vance's lawyer demanded a recess. Reporters who had been waiting in the hall caught snippets of the shouting and began flooding the story online. The narrative shattered completely. Sandra was no longer on trial. The entire system that had empowered Vance was. In the hallway during the recess, Sandra was approached by Evelyn Shaw. "The medical board is opening a full investigation into Vance and Mercy General's oversight. Your case is the tip of the spear, but I have to ask your license. To really change things, you need to be back on the inside. Will you reactivate it?" Sandra looked down the hall towards the ER, the epicenter of the chaos. "I didn't want to come back," she said softly. "But they're not the only ones who need healing." The board reconvened an hour later, but the outcome was preordained. Vance was suspended indefinitely, pending the investigations. All charges against Sandra were dismissed. The board issued a public statement praising her extraordinary skill and composure. But as Sandra left the building, she wasn't met with cheers from the staff. Instead, she saw a division. Some nurses hugged her. Others, particularly those allied with Vance or afraid of the coming shakeup, turned away. The victory was hollow and had ignited a civil war within the hospital's walls. That night, the story reached its next viral peak. News outlets ran side-by-side comparisons. Vance's fabricated fellowship versus Sandra's verified military honors. Commentators dissected the systemic failure. The hospital's donor board, fearing reputational collapse, demanded swift action. Dr. Reed was forced to resign. The interim chief medical officer appointed was Dr. Aris Thorne, the ER director who had supported Sandra. His first act was to offer Sandra a formal position in the hospital's trauma training program. His second was to announce an external audit of every physician's credentials. But the counterattack from the old guard was swift and dirty. Anonymous emails began circulating among the surgical staff, claiming Sandra was a trauma junkie who missed the adrenaline of war and had used Miguel as a prop. Vance, from his suspension, gave a covert interview to a tabloid, painting himself as a victim of cancel culture and Sandra as a mentally unstable veteran. The state medical board, overwhelmed by the case's publicity, placed Sandra's license reactivation under extraordinary review, a bureaucratic limbo that could take months. She was, in the eyes of the law, still not a doctor. The final twist came from Miguel's bedside. His recovery was difficult, and a hospital-acquired infection set in. The culture revealed it was a resistant strain, one that had been traced to lax sterilization protocols in Vance's operating rooms. The infection was potentially fatal. The family, once grateful, now turned their anguish outward. They filed a notice of intent to sue the hospital for malpractice, nomming not just the hospital but Vance and, in a cruel twist, Sandra, for her unauthorized intervention that they now claimed had introduced the infection. The lawsuit was a legal long shot, but its effect was devastating. The hospital's insurance lawyers saw Sandra as a liability. Dr. Thorne's job offer was quietly rescinded. Sandra stood outside Mercy General at 3 a.m., looking at the glowing ER doors. She had won the battle in the boardroom, but the war for the soul of the place was just beginning. She had exposed the rot, but now she was caught in the collapse. To save the hospital, to save the next Miguel, she couldn't just be a whistleblower or a symbol. She had to become something the system could not ignore. She had to become a doctor again, officially, and then tear the system down from the inside. The path forward was clear, and it led not to the janitor's closet, but back into the fire of a fight she had never wanted. Sandra didn't apply for her license through the normal channels. She knew bureaucracy was a war of attrition. Instead, she went to the source. With Evelyn Shaw's counsel, she petitioned the state medical board for an emergency reinstatement based on eminent need and proven skill, attaching the combat footage analysis, Miguel's medical records, and sworn affidavits from every trauma specialist who had reviewed her case. Simultaneously, she filed a formal whistleblower complaint against the hospital's credentialing committee with the Department of Health, detailing Vance's forged fellowship and the board's failure to verify it. She turned the system's own rules into a pincer movement. The public pressure was now a sustained roar. The veterans groups organized rallies outside the medical board's offices. National medical associations, embarrassed by the spotlight on credentialing failures, issued statements supporting a streamlined reinstatement for physicians with exemplary service. The lawsuit from Miguel's family took an unexpected turn. Their lawyer, upon reviewing the new evidence of Vance's negligence and the hospital's infected sterilization protocols, dropped Sandra from the suit and instead named Vance and the hospital corporation as sole defendants. Sandra was no longer a target. She was a key witness for the prosecution. Inside Mercy General, the external audit ordered by Dr. Thorne was an earthquake. It found discrepancies in the credentials of 3 other surgeons and over a dozen nurses. The entire department was placed on provisional accreditation. The hospital's funding was in jeopardy. The board of directors, now comprised of several new members appointed by furious donors, had one mission: survival. They offered Sandra a settlement and a non-disclosure agreement. She refused both. She didn't want money or silence. She wanted 2 things: her active medical license and a seat on the hospital's new quality oversight committee with veto power. The medical board, facing a political and public relations nightmare, fast-tracked her hearing. It was not in a sterile conference room, but in a public auditorium, live-streamed. The board's chairman questioned her not about lapsed paperwork, but about ethics. "Ms. Wilson, you operated without a license. You broke the law to save a life. Does the end justify the means?" Sandra looked at the camera, then at the panel. "The law you serve is meant to protect patients. When the system you built fails them, when it protects fraudulent surgeons and punishes those who intervene, then the spirit of that law is already broken. I didn't break the law to save Miguel. I fulfilled medicine's oldest oath in the gap your bureaucracy created. After 15 minutes of deliberation, the chairman announced the decision. The board finds that the evidence of skill is irrefutable. The public need is clear. The license of Sandra Wilson is hereby reinstated, effective immediately. The applause in the room was thunderous, but Sandra's face showed only grim determination. The victory was a tool, not a trophy. She walked out of that hearing and straight into Mercy General, not to the janitor's locker room, but to the office of the chief of surgery. Dr. Thorne was waiting. He handed her a white coat, a hospital ID identifying her as Sandra Wilson, MD, Trauma Systems Director. Her first official act was to call a mandatory meeting for all surgical staff. She stood before a room of hundreds, the same surgeons who had ignored her, the nurses who had whispered about her, the residents who had filmed her. She didn't talk about the past. She projected a new organizational chart. Effective today, we are dismantling the surgical silos. All trauma cases will be run by a unified team led by the most qualified person in the room, not the person with the fanciest title. We are implementing a military-style morbidity and mortality review, where every error is analyzed without blame, to learn, not to punish. She then announced a new partnership with the local VA hospital to train combat medics in civilian trauma care, and to fast-track veterans with medical skills into support roles at Mercy. She was building a bridge between two worlds that desperately needed each other. Richard Vance's career ended not with a bang, but with a signature. Facing multiple investigations, the malpractice suit, and the certain revocation of his license, he accepted a permanent surrender of his medical credentials. He left the state. The hospital settled with Miguel's family for an undisclosed sum, and more importantly, implemented the new sterilization protocols Sandra demanded. Miguel eventually walked out of the hospital, a living testament to the change that one act of courage had unleashed. But the final surprising detail came 6 months later. Sandra, now firmly in her directorship, was reviewing applications for the new Veterans Training Program. One application stopped her cold. The name was David Wilson. It was her nephew, her brother's son, who had just finished his tour as a Navy corpsman. He'd written in his personal statement, "My aunt showed me that the fight doesn't end when you take off the uniform. Sometimes, that's when it truly begins." She hired him on the spot, not as a favor, but as the first participant in her pilot program to integrate former combat medics as physician assistants in the ER. The culture at Mercy General shifted, slowly and painfully. Not everyone embraced the new order. Some senior surgeons resigned, but the metrics didn't lie. Surgical complication rates dropped by 18% in the first quarter. Trauma response times improved. Employee satisfaction scores among nurses skyrocketed. The hospital went from being a scandal-ridden institution to a national case study in transformative leadership. Sandra's office door remained open, and her first stop every morning was still the ER floor, where she would talk not just to doctors, but to the custodial staff, the orderlies, the security guards. She listened. The story that began with a sneer in a hallway, "You can't even read," ended with a new line written into the hospital's core values. Expertise is everywhere. Dignity is non-negotiable. Sandra Wilson proved that sometimes, to fix a broken system, you need someone who knows how to operate in chaos, someone who understands that the most profound repairs often begin not at the top, but in the spaces everyone else overlooks. Her battle was over, but her mission had just become her legacy. And as the next shift began at Mercy General, the quiet hum of a hospital working as it should was the only victory speech she ever wanted. The story of Sandra Wilson feels like a modern fable, but its roots are buried deep in medical history. It echoes the life of Vivian Thomas, the black man who pioneered cardiac surgery while listed on the payroll as a janitor, whispering guidance to the chief of surgery who took the credit. It mirrors the journey of Shay Taylor Allen, who went viral just last year for returning as a doctor to the same hospital where she once pushed a cleaning cart. These are not isolated incidents. They are symptoms of a system that often confuses title with talent and pedigree with proficiency. Studies show that while black professionals make up 40% of the population, they hold just 16% of hospital leadership roles. Over a third of healthcare workers witness discrimination in their own departments. Sandra's confrontation was about more than one arrogant surgeon. It was about the filters we use to decide who is an expert and who is invisible. Her victory wasn't just personal, it became a blueprint. It proved that credentialing should verify skill, not just pedigree. It showed that the best person to fix a broken system might be the one who has been silently observing its failures from the ground floor. So the lingering question isn't just what happened at Mercy General. It's a question for every institution, every workplace, every community. Who is the Sandra Wilson in your world? Who possesses profound skill hidden behind an unassuming title, dismissed because they don't fit the traditional image of authority? The next breakthrough, the next life-saving idea, the next transformative change might not come from the corner office. It might be coming from the person quietly emptying the trash, waiting for the moment when someone finally thinks to ask, or better yet, when the situation demands they no longer wait to be asked. If you were inspired by this story of hidden identity and justice served, let us know by liking this video. It helps us bring you more content that challenges the status quo. Make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell, because tomorrow we're uncovering the story of a substitute teacher who walked into a failing classroom and revealed she was a former secretary of education. You won't want to miss it. Until then, look a little closer at the people around you. Expertise wears many uniforms.